The old cardboard box sat motionless on Emma's kitchen table for 3 long hours, a silent ghost from the past she had buried for 13 years. Inside were faded scraps of paper notes written in the familiar hand of her father, Jack Sullivan, a seasoned FBI investigator who had specialized in tracing financial crimes. He had died in a so-called car accident when Emma was 19. But she had never believed it was an accident. The case had closed far too quickly, the report too brief, and the unease inside her had never gone away. She knew her father had been investigating something too big, too dangerous. And this box, the last thing he left behind, had remained unopened ever since. She had hidden it away in storage, moved it from city to city, trying to forget. But tonight was different. Tonight, a strange text message appeared on her phone screen, like a voice rising from the depths of her past. Your father did not die in an accident. The truth is buried where he rests. Leave tonight. Emma had almost ignored it. She had work to do, a deadline for an article due at the paper. But in the end, she put on her raincoat, grabbed her car keys, and drove into the stormy darkness, heading toward Fairmount Cemetery 45 minutes outside Portland, where her father was buried. She had no idea that by doing so, she was setting in motion a strange ritual. When her car turned through the cemetery gates just before midnight, she switched off the headlights, parked behind a maintenance shed, and quietly made her way toward the small hill crowned by an old oak tree. Her father's grave lay beneath that tree, the same place he had taken her camping when she was a child. But as she stepped onto the narrow path leading up the hill, she froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. In front of her stood 10 men in black suits, arranged in a half circle around her father's headstone. Each one was silent and perfectly still, unmoved by the cold drizzle falling through the night. Black SUVs lined the path, their reflections trembling in the rain. Emma ducked behind a large marble monument, holding her breath as she watched. This couldn't be a coincidence. This wasn't a prank. One man stepped forward, bent down, and placed a small white cloth bag on the stone carved with the name Jack Sullivan. He whispered something, his voice low, the words unclear, but the cadence sounded Italian. When he stood, the entire group bowed their heads in silence, as if in mourning, or perhaps swearing an oath she could not understand. 30 seconds later, they turned away, one by one, returning to their vehicles with the precision of a trained unit. Engines hummed softly, and the cars rolled off into the darkness, disappearing like the last flickers of dying fire. Emma waited another 5 minutes, hearing nothing but the steady patter of rain and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then she stepped forward, trembling, and approached her father's grave. On the wet, cold stone sat the white cloth bag, heavy in her hands, its strings tied neatly. Resting on top was a small folded note, written in a steady slanted script with black ink. Jack Sullivan. Her hands shook as she opened the bag. Inside were thick stacks of $100 bills bound with rubber bands. She didn't need to count. There were tens of thousands of dollars. Nestled among the money was another handwritten card in the same hand as before. It read, "The debt is paid. Forgive me, Jack Sullivan. The Mafia never repays a favor unless a life has been saved." Before we go any further, if you're feeling the same chills as Emma did standing in the middle of a cemetery in the rain that night, where the past suddenly came back to life with a mysterious message, then subscribe to Underworld Love Stories to hear more secret, emotional, and breathtaking stories like this every day. Hit like if you believe that sometimes the truth isn't dead, it's just waiting for someone to step into the darkness to find it. And I want to ask you, where are you hearing this story from? Comment your city or country, so we know where in the world the Underworld Love Stories journey has touched your heart. Now back to Emma Sullivan. Emma stood motionless before her father's grave, her hand still clutching the small card as if it were the last thread connecting her to him. The rain had begun to fall harder, and the wind blew her soaked hair against her cheeks. She stared at the trembling words illuminated by the dim flashlight on her phone. "The debt is paid. Forgive me, Jack Sullivan." Someone had written those words by hand with a strange reverence for a man the entire system had long abandoned. Emma didn't understand. But she knew one thing for certain. This was no coincidence. For 13 years, no one had mentioned her father's death. No one had ever questioned the thin, hastily written police report that concluded: a car accident caused by slippery roads, the victim dead at the scene, no signs of foul play. Yet this card, the bag of money, the men in black beneath the rain, it all felt like a door suddenly creaking open after years of being sealed shut. When she returned to her car, her heart still pounding wildly, her phone vibrated again in her hand. A new message, with no name, no number, just 3 words. "Leave now." Emma lifted her head, scanning the parking lot. No one was there. The cemetery was quiet, the cars gone, the faint light from the gate flickering weakly through the rain. But her instincts told her she was being watched. She got into her car, locked the doors, and drove off immediately. As she turned out of the cemetery gates, her rearview mirror caught a shadow shifting behind the oak tree right where her father's grave lay. A person? Or just her imagination? Back at her small apartment on Alberta Street, Emma sank to the floor, the bag of money resting on the table. She didn't touch it again. No one left that much cash on a grave out of pity. This was a message. And her father, though long gone, was still speaking to her, in his own way. The handwritten card lay open beside the pile of old documents. "The debt is paid. Forgive me." Those words echoed in her mind, shattering the silence like a broken whisper in the dark. Curiosity rising, she opened her laptop and dug through the digital copies of her father's accident file she had requested from the police years ago. Nothing new. But then she remembered something he had once told her when she was just a little girl. "If one day I'm gone, find my message where it's always been." That sentence had been meaningless to her for years, but now it resurfaced in her mind like a map drawn by fate itself. When the clock on her laptop struck 2:17 a.m., Emma's phone rang. An unknown number. No name. No familiar area code. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the screen. Then, after a few seconds, she answered. On the other end was a man's voice, low, calm, deliberate, as if trained to speak in front of a crowd. "Emma, don't hang up. I know you don't trust anyone, but I need you to listen." She said nothing. The voice continued. "Your father saved my life 15 years ago. Back then, I was a foolish kid born into the wrong family. He had enough evidence to put me away for 20 years, but instead, he gave me a choice: either disappear from that world forever or be destroyed by it. I chose differently. I owe him my life." Emma swallowed hard. The tone carried an unsettling honesty. She gripped the phone and whispered, "Who are you?" A pause. Then the man replied, "My name is Luca Romano. If you truly want to know why your father died, come find me. My office is downtown Portland. Romano Security. 4th floor. Corner of 10th and Everett. I'll be waiting, but only if you're ready for the truth." The call ended. Emma sat still in the quiet kitchen, the rain tapping softly against the window. She had just heard the name of a man her father had never mentioned. Yet something in his voice felt as if he were carrying a piece of her father's last breath. And deep down, she knew the truth no longer lay inside that box. It was waiting for her somewhere else. And if she truly wanted to find it, she would have to step into the very world her father had spent his life trying to keep her away from. The next morning, though the sky was still heavy and gray after a night of endless rain, Emma returned to Fairmount Cemetery. She hadn't told anyone about her trip. Camille would have stopped her for sure. That friend had always been the voice of reason, the one who had urged her to let go of the secrets buried more than a decade ago. But Emma couldn't stop now. Not after the midnight call. Not after hearing the name Luca Romano. And especially not after seeing the hollow reflection of herself in the mirror, the woman who had never truly accepted her father's death. Fairmount looked just as quiet as it had the night before, but daylight made it seem less eerie. She walked along the stone paths, clutching the lapels of her coat, her eyes scanning the old headstones one by one. When she reached the hill crowned by the great oak tree where her father rested, she paused. No one was there. No trace of last night remained, except for a few tire marks pressed into the wet soil, almost covered now by fallen leaves. The bag of money was gone, locked away in her apartment cabinet. But what caught her attention was something small, half buried at the base of the oak, near a shallow dip in the earth to the right of the headstone. She knelt and picked it up. It was a silver lighter engraved with two initials, GR. It wasn't her father's. She was certain of that. Jack Sullivan never smoked, and he never owned anything so luxurious. She turned it over in her hand, noticing a small dent on the bottom, as if it had been dropped with force. Perhaps it belonged to one of the 10 men from the night before. Emma slipped the lighter into her coat pocket and sat before her father's grave, her chest tightening. For 13 years she had avoided this place, sending flowers on anniversaries and holidays, but never daring to come herself, too afraid to face the emptiness his death had left behind. Now she found herself not only facing a stone marker, but the weight of unanswered questions. Pulling out her phone, she opened the message from the night before. The number was still anonymous, impossible to trace. In the pale sunlight, the words, "The truth is buried where he rests," seemed heavier than ever. It wasn't just a metaphor. It could be literal. Something might actually be buried here. Emma studied the ground carefully. Nothing looked unusual except for a patch of soil that seemed slightly sunken on the left side of the grave. A faint depression, as if someone had knelt or stood there for too long. She took a few steps back. The feeling of being watched washed over her again. Not like in a horror movie, this was real, instinctive. The sensation of eyes, somewhere nearby. She turned. A man stood about 30 feet away, near the path that led down the hill. He was tall, wearing a long black coat that brushed his knees, his face sharp and calm. Dark hair, lightly tanned skin, and eyes as cutting as glass watching her without blinking. Emma rose to her feet, her hand instinctively going to her pocket, where the lighter was. The man walked toward her, his steps slow but steady. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped. His voice was deep and smooth, carrying clearly through the cold air. "Emma Sullivan?" She nodded silently. He gave a small nod in return. "I'm Giovanni Romano, but most people call me Luca." A shiver ran down her spine. The name she had heard in the call last night now stood before her in flesh and blood. The man her father had once saved, the one who had returned a debt 13 years in the making. Luca's gaze softened as he looked down at the grave. "He was a good man," he said quietly. "The last good man I ever met in that world." Emma's voice trembled slightly. "Then why are you here now?" "Because you're finally ready," Luca replied without hesitation. "If I'd come sooner, you wouldn't have believed me. If I'd come later, you might have been buried with the secret." The words sliced through the air like a thin blade, not drawing blood, but leaving her skin cold and tight. Luca reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. Romano Security. The address printed beneath it was in downtown Portland. "When you're ready to know the full truth about your father's death," he said, "come find me. But only if you truly want to know." Emma looked at the card in her hand, then lifted her gaze to his. "How do I know I can trust you?" Luca tilted his head slightly. "You don't. But you will. Because the truth always finds its way home." Then he turned and walked down the path, his tall figure fading behind the trees. Emma stood there, gripping the card tightly as the wind stirred through the oak's branches. She was no longer alone before that grave. She had just opened the first door, and beyond it lay the world her father had died trying to keep her from. 2 days after the strange encounter at the cemetery, Emma stood before the granite building on the corner of 10th and Everett, the address written on Luca Romano's card. Romano's security occupied the fourth floor. There was no grand sign, no display of prestige. The lobby was muted in tone, impeccably neat, and so orderly it felt cold. A woman dressed in a black business suit gave Emma a brief professional glance, before motioning her toward the elevator, no unnecessary words. The ride up was swift. When the doors slid open, a gray carpeted hallway stretched before her, leading to a heavy wooden door bearing a polished brass nameplate, Giovanni Luca Romano, Director. She took a deep breath and knocked. A low voice from inside invited her in. Luca rose from behind a desk so neat it was almost bare. The daylight streaming through the tall windows illuminated his face more clearly than it had under the cemetery's rain. His eyes were less severe now, though still difficult to read. Emma sat across from him on a leather chair, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here. Tell me why my father died." Luca nodded slowly, then opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder bound with gray fabric. He placed it between them on the desk. "This is a copy of what I've kept for 13 years, he said quietly. "But before you read it, I want to tell you a story. The story of your father and of me." Emma said nothing. She sat upright, her gaze fixed on him. Luca's voice deepened as he spoke, as though peeling back layers of memory long sealed away. "I was born into what people like to call a traditional family. Our tradition was money laundering, arms trafficking, and moving goods without papers through the docks. My grandfather started it, my father carried it on, and I was the heir without ever having a choice. When I was 19, I took part in a smuggling operation without realizing it was tied to a human trafficking network. I was a foolish kid trying to prove myself, never understanding how close I was to falling into the abyss. When the FBI got involved, it didn't take them long to find out who I was, where I lived, and what I had done." He paused, his gaze distant, fixed on the air behind her. "But the agent assigned to my case was your father, Jack Sullivan. A man unlike any investigator I've ever known. He didn't just see crimes, he saw people. He had all the evidence to put me behind bars. But instead, he gave me two choices. 1, 20 years in prison. 2, walk away from that world, rebuild my life, and never look back." I never understood why he did it. Maybe because I was the only one in that file who hadn't spilled blood, or maybe he saw something left to save. Luca's eyes softened briefly. "I chose the second path." Emma remained silent, her lips pressed together. Luca continued. "I disappeared for 4 years, worked manual jobs in Anchorage, went back to college with money I earned by hand, cut off all ties with my old family. When I returned to Oregon, I was ready to live a different life. Romano Security started from nothing. No allies, no funding, just the skills I had and one principle: to protect what's right, even if it means protecting it from what's wrong." He exhaled quietly. "Your father knew I had come back. One afternoon, he walked into this very office without warning, sat right where you are sitting now. He didn't accuse, didn't question. He only asked me one thing. 'If something ever happens to me, will you keep your promise?' I said yes." He nodded once and left. A week later, he was dead. A car accident. The case was closed far too quickly. I knew it wasn't coincidence, but I had no proof. Only a feeling. Luca's voice lowered to a near whisper. "So I started watching. Quietly. I tracked the names in his last investigation, people he had been pursuing in the final months of his life. And when I saw you access his old files 3 months ago, I knew the time had come. Emma felt her chest tighten as if an invisible hand were gripping it. The words she had read over and over in her father's old notebook now came alive through the voice of this man. She glanced at the folder between them, yellowed papers, surveillance photos, familiar names. Luca spoke softly. This isn't the whole truth, but it's the beginning. And if you're ready, I'll take you to the place your father once walked into. The place where one honest investigator nearly brought down an entire human trafficking network. Emma reached out and opened the file. Inside were maps, photographs, leaked reports, and at the end, a single picture of Jack Sullivan, standing outside a warehouse on the outskirts of Portland, camera in hand, his eyes sharp as a blade. She swallowed hard. I want to know everything, she said quietly. And this time, I'm not running. Luca nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting 13 years to hear those words. The old file opened like a doorway, leading Emma into a world of memories she had never been allowed to touch. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with a mix of typewritten lines and hurried handwriting, maps drawn in fading blue ink. Some sections were crossed out, rewritten, and annotated in pencil along the margins, all in Jack Sullivan's hand. These weren't official records. They were his private notes, gathered in silence, outside the boundaries of his assignment, written when he realized the network he was pursuing stretched far beyond the reach of the law. Emma turned each page slowly, her chest tightening. Pinned inside was a map of Oregon marked with 3 red circles, an abandoned warehouse in Gresham, a private residence near the Columbia River, and a run-down roadside motel along Interstate 5. Each site was followed by Jack's short handwritten notes, the words rushed but sharp. Gresham, shipment at 2 a.m. Women blindfolded. Columbia. Exchange lasted 10 minutes. No one stayed long. Interstate motel. Waiting point. Women do not speak English. The words sent a chill through her. Her instincts as a journalist told her immediately what her father had uncovered. He hadn't just been tracing a human trafficking ring, he was following the trail of a tightly run operation, protected by money, influence, and silence. The next pages were filled with copies of old faxed bank transfers. The sender and recipient names were masked by codes, but beside them were handwritten decryptions in Jack's script offshore accounts, shifting money across 4 countries, each transfer worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some entries were circled in red, marked with a note. Same day, 2 South Asian women disappeared from Portland. Emma clenched her fist. She remembered faintly the old news headlines scattered reports of missing women, dismissed for lack of leads, never tied together. No one had connected them. No one except her father. Luca sat quietly as she read. He didn't interrupt or explain, he just watched. When she reached the final page, she found a hand-drawn map in blue pen, tracing routes from Seattle down to Portland, then across to Spokane. In her father's last note, written at the bottom, was a single chilling line: not ordinary trafficking. Protected. Someone in the government. Beneath the sentence, he had drawn a triangle, each corner marked with a symbol she didn't recognize. Luca leaned forward and pointed to one of the markings. This, he said softly, was the old logo of an NGO that operated along the Mexican border. On paper, they ran humanitarian missions. In reality, they were a front for smuggling people across state lines. Your father knew, but without official proof, he couldn't go public. Emma looked at him, her throat tight. And the other 2? One, Luca said, tapping another symbol. Belongs to a private investment fund based in New York. They claim to support education and healthcare. In truth, they laundered money for the same network your father was exposing. He hesitated before touching the last symbol. His eyes darkened. The third isn't an organization. It's a person. A name I can't give you yet. But that's the one who ordered your father's case to be closed. Silence filled the room. Emma's heart felt as though someone had set a heavy stone upon it. She had never imagined her father's death was entangled with such a cruel, powerful underworld. Yet every piece of this puzzle pointed toward the same unseen center, a core of influence that shaped what others were forbidden to see. She lifted her gaze to Luca. Why did you keep all of this for so long? Why not tell someone? He met her eyes calmly. Because if I'd spoken when no one wanted to listen, it wouldn't have been the truth. Only when you found it when you were ready did the truth have a chance to live again. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, steady now. She knew there was no turning back. She was no longer the woman who ran from grief and fear. Not after reading her father's words, written like a final confession. He had gone as far as he could to uncover the truth. Now it was her turn to follow where he left off. That evening, Emma left the Romano security office with her father's file carefully copied and tucked inside the leather crossbody bag at her side. Outside, Portland lay under a fine misting rain, the kind that felt more like fog than water, stretching endlessly beneath a low gray sky. Her mind was still spinning with the symbols, maps, money trails, and coded names her father had left behind. Luca had offered to drive her home, but she declined, saying she needed time alone to think. He studied her for a long moment before nodding, his voice low and deliberate as he said, "Don't drive straight home." She had thought it was just a cautious habit and instinct from his line of work. But only 2 hours later, Emma realized it had been more than a casual warning. She stopped at a small cafe in the Alberta district, the same one where she used to write essays as a college student. Ordering a hot Americano, she chose a seat by the window, opened her laptop, and began comparing her father's old maps with archived data from an investigative article she had once written about human trafficking routes in the Pacific Northwest. The overlap sent a chill racing up her spine. Gresham, Columbia, Interstate Motel. She couldn't believe she had lived surrounded by these places without ever realizing their meaning. While she was absorbed in reading, a flicker of motion outside caught her eye. A man in a hooded jacket was leaning against a lamppost across the street. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't on his phone. He was simply standing there still, watching. His eyes fixed on the cafe window, unblinking. Emma pretended not to notice. She shut her laptop slowly and sent a short text to Luca. "Someone's following me." After hitting send, she took her coffee and stepped into the restroom, forcing herself to breathe evenly. When she returned 5 minutes later, the man was still there. But as soon as she moved toward the door, he pushed away from the lamppost and began walking down the sidewalk, keeping pace with her on the opposite side of the street. Her heart began to pound. Emma quickened her steps, turning into a narrow side alley, hoping to reach a busier, better-lit road ahead. But before she could, the echo of footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. She spun around. The man was only a few yards away now, his face hidden beneath the hood, his posture predatory. Instinct took over. Emma fished her car keys from her bag, gripping them tightly between her fingers as an improvised weapon. Then she turned and ran. The footsteps followed, fast and heavy. She darted through the back door of a commercial building, shoving it open with a metallic clang, and sprinted down the dim corridor toward the underground parking level. The slam of the door behind her told her he was still coming. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. As she burst into the garage, the motion lights flicked on, casting pale reflections off concrete pillars. Her car was parked in the far corner. No one else was there. She didn't look back. She ran straight for the car, unlocked it, and slammed the door shut, locking it in one motion. A second later, a dark shape struck the driver's side window with a forceful thud. Emma screamed. Flooring the gas pedal, the tires squealed, and the car shot forward, fishtailing toward the exit. When she reached the main road, her hands were shaking so hard she could barely keep the wheel steady. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Luca. Where are you? I'm coming. She typed back her location and pulled into a gas station, where a night shift attendant stood beneath the fluorescent lights. Inside the small convenience store, she tried to steady her breathing, but her body trembled uncontrollably. 15 minutes later, Luca arrived. He didn't ask if she was all right. He only met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. They know, he said. They know you're reopening your father's case. Emma sank onto a plastic bench near the window, her voice barely holding steady. Why tonight? How could they find out so fast? Luca sat across from her, his expression hardening. Because you started connecting the dots. And because they know that if you're smart enough to understand what your father left behind, you might be a bigger threat than he ever was. Emma swallowed hard. The realization hit her like a collapsing wall behind it, a darkness deeper than she had imagined and no way back. Yet in her eyes, a flicker of defiance remained. What do I do now? She whispered. Luca studied her for a long moment. You come with me, he said. Right now. I'll take you somewhere safe. From this point on, every move you make will be watched. You're not an outsider anymore. Emma nodded slowly. For the first time, she understood what it meant to live in a world where the truth could kill you, but silence could destroy you even faster. Luca drove through the night, heading east out of Portland along the winding, desolate roads that climb toward the Cascade Mountains. The sky was still dark, and the thick fog wrapped around them like a living thing, swallowing the road ahead so completely that the headlights could barely cut through a few yards at a time. Emma sat quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the blurred shapes of pine trees gliding past the window. Everything had happened too fast, too suddenly. Only days ago she'd been a journalist clinging to the fading memories of her father. Now she was being hunted by an invisible force. Yet inside her, the raw fear had begun to change, turning into something heavier, sharper, steadier. Determination. If her father had faced this darkness and stood his ground, then so could she. When the car turned onto a gravel path cutting through the forest, Emma realized how far they had gone from the city. Luca stopped in front of a small wooden cabin tucked deep in a valley, the warm yellow light from its porch spilling onto the mist. Safe house, he said. One of several, once used for witnesses or high-risk clients. The cabin was simple but solid, reinforced with hidden cameras and coded entry locks. Inside, it was compact but functional, stocked with food, emergency gear, communication devices, and a sealed room meant for confidential files. Luca handed Emma a set of dry clothes and told her to rest upstairs. But even as exhaustion seeped through her bones, sleep refused to come. The images looped endlessly in her head. The man who had followed her, the sound of fists slamming against her car window, the look in Luca's eyes beneath the sterile lights of that gas station. She threw on a sweater and went downstairs, where the soft glow from a laptop screen lit the kitchen. Luca was seated before it, the reflection of the screen cutting a pale outline across his serious face. He looked up as she approached. "You want to know more?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded and sat opposite him. Luca turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a vast network map, lines and arrows connecting major West Coast cities to small, unnamed points stretching all the way to the Mexican border. "This," he said, "is the internal logistics network of the trafficking ring your father was investigating." Next to each route were notations, financial codes, timestamps, and occasionally a set of initials that meant nothing to her. But one mark appeared again and again. A circle with a line slashed through it, placed beside every major transaction point. Luca tapped the symbol with his finger. "That's the sign of the coordinator. Not the boss, but the one who knows the map. The one who keeps the system moving. He hides behind intermediaries, never uses his real identity. But your father got closer to him than anyone ever did." He reached for another file beside the computer, flipping it open to reveal a typed report yellowed by time. In a confidential note, one only he and I ever saw your father described a meeting at the Gresham warehouse. There was a man there wearing a fedora, speaking with an East Coast accent. He never used a name, but one of his men called him Jude. Emma frowned. The name stirred something uneasy inside her, as if she had heard it once in a dream. Jude is a ghost, Luca continued. No photos, no records, no accounts. But every time he appears, people vanish within hours. No one who's met him has lived to talk about it except one man. My father, Emma said softly. Luca nodded. But he never described Jude's face. Maybe to protect his family. Maybe because he knew that once it was written down, someone else would become the target. Emma stared at the screen. Below the map were columns of encrypted text intercepted internal messages between servers, now partially decoded. Some had been translated into English. One in particular made her blood run cold. 6 units expected on the 14th night. Cargo ready. Contact. J. And beneath it, in her father's handwriting, a note in bold blue ink. Must stop before the 7th appears. Emma's voice trembled. What does that mean? Luca pressed a key, and a photo appeared on the screen. A little girl, dark-haired, about 10 years old, stood beside an old truck, her eyes wide, staring straight into the camera. Beneath it, in her father's hand, 3 words. Not too late. Emma turned away, her throat tightening. She didn't need to ask what the message meant. From that moment on, she understood that every step she took would be one more step along her father's path, and that at the end of that road, the truth was waiting. But she also knew that the price of reaching it would demand more than courage. It might demand her life. The night at the mountain cabin was unnervingly still. There were no car horns, no streetlights, only the whisper of wind threading through the pine branches and the quiet crackle of the fire in the small stone hearth. Emma sat curled up in an old armchair across from Luca, holding a cup of hot tea he had made for her. The steam rose between them, softening her already tired eyes, the faint puffiness beneath them betraying how little she had slept. After everything she had read, the photographs, the coded documents, the fragments of her father's investigation, and the shadow of the man called Jude, she had expected her mind to spin, her heart to pound uncontrollably. Yet instead, she felt calm. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was because the quiet steadiness of Luca's presence across from her had become, in its own unspoken way, a fragile anchor. Luca said little. He simply sat there, watching the fire, occasionally glancing her way, as if to make sure she was still breathing evenly, still grounded. She knew he was a man who had lived in the dark once, who carried a debt that could never be repaid with money, and that her father had been the one to place him at the crossroads that had changed his life. They were 2 people from opposite worlds, yet both bore the scar of the same man who was now gone. Emma set her cup down on the worn wooden table and broke the silence. Did my father ever talk about me? Luca lifted his head. Yes, he said after a pause. Not often, but enough for me to know he was proud. He always carried a photograph of you in his wallet. Once he showed it to me, you were smiling in front of a newsroom, an old camera hanging around your neck. He said it was the one thing he refused to let the darkness touch. Emma fell silent, the words lingering between them. I always thought he didn't trust me enough to handle the truth, she said softly. But now I realize maybe he just wanted me to have an ordinary life. Luca nodded slowly. He gave up the truth to keep you safe. But he also knew there would come a time when you'd have to face it. And when that time came, he made sure I'd be here. Emma looked at him, then really looked at him. His eyes were steady, deep, holding something that felt both fierce and fragile. You're the only one left who truly knows what my father fought for, she whispered. And right now, you're the only one I can trust. He studied her face for a long moment before replying, his voice quiet but unwavering. I'm not a good man, Emma. I was part of the world your father despised. I don't ask for forgiveness, but I won't let you walk this path alone. The words weren't a promise, nor a confession. They were something deeper, an unspoken vow from a man who had already seen the edge of the abyss and would not let anyone else fall into it. Emma felt a slow warmth bloom in her chest. It wasn't passion. It wasn't the dizzy pulse of infatuation. It was something gentler, a rare peace, fragile and steady, amid the storm quietly forming beyond those mountain walls. Neither of them spoke again. Emma leaned her head against the armrest, her eyes fixed on the steady rhythm of the fire. Luca sat beside her, not touching, leaving just enough space for her to feel his presence without words. Between them lay a silence that spoke more clearly than any conversation, an understanding built not from explanations, but from shared loss. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, Luca rose, took a light blanket from the couch, and draped it gently over her shoulders. He lingered there for a few seconds, watching her face softened by sleep, then turned back to the desk. The glow of his laptop cast a cold light over his features as lines of code scrolled across the screen. But in that moment, he was no longer a man repaying a life debt. He had become the last sentinel of the truth Jack Sullivan had died to protect. And Emma, though she didn't yet know, it had already become the key, the final piece capable of breaking the long chain of violence and silence that had bound them all. In that quiet mountain night, two wounded souls sat in a small cabin surrounded by trees, saying nothing at all. But in their silence, everything that needed to be said was already spoken. The morning light broke softly through the veil of mist that clung to the forest surrounding the mountain cabin. When Emma opened her eyes, the quiet was almost deceptive too, calm, too still, as though the world was holding its breath. It wasn't the unfamiliar bed or the stillness that unsettled her. It was the air itself, heavy with a tension she couldn't name. She washed her face and went downstairs. Luca was in the kitchen, boiling water, his movements steady, but his eyes carried a tightness that betrayed the calm mask he wore. He waited until she had taken the first sip of coffee before sliding a phone across the table. A message came in at 5:14 this morning, he said quietly. Emma frowned and picked it up. On the screen was a single line of text block letters, written without spaces, jagged and impersonal. Stop. Do not dig deeper. There is still one more life to lose. Beneath it was a photo. Her hand went cold. It was Camille, her best friend. Her wrists bound, mouth taped, eyes wide in terror beneath flickering fluorescent light. The camera angle was deliberate, professional. Behind her was a cracked concrete wall shaped like an X, and a rusted ceiling fan hung motionless above. Camille's shoulders trembled in the frame as if she had been trying to signal something. Emma sank into a chair, her heartbeat hammering so violently it hurt. The color drained from her face as her trembling hands clutched the phone. Luca leaned closer, enlarging the photo, scanning every detail before launching a tracing program on his own device. No GPS data, no embedded metadata, he muttered. They scrubbed everything clean. Whoever sent this knows how to erase a trail. Emma's voice came out broken, barely more than a whisper. They've taken Camille. She's the only person I trust besides you. Luca's face hardened, the warmth in his eyes replaced by steel. That's exactly why they took her. They know you'll falter if someone close to you gets hurt. It's how they control people, cut off every emotional tether. Emma stood abruptly, pacing the room, her breath uneven. Camille didn't do anything. She's just an editor. She had nothing to do with my father's case. Luca looked up, his tone grave. Except she was with you that day in the archives. That's all it takes to become a target. Emma pressed her hands against her temples, her mind spinning, guilt rising like a tide she couldn't fight. The thought of what Camille might be enduring twisted something deep inside her, but the fear in her chest suddenly cooled, solidified into something sharp like steel tempered by fire and plunged into ice. She lifted her head, her eyes steady. They want me to stop. They think taking Camille will make me turn back. But if I stop now, there will be 10 more Camilles. Luca didn't respond immediately. He studied her, his silence heavy with the recognition that something in her had changed. Then he nodded once. I'll find her. But I can't work from this photo alone. I need to know everything Camille's done or said lately. Messages, calls, anything unusual. Emma grabbed her phone and scrolled through her call log. There it was, a missed call from Camille 2 nights earlier, the same evening Emma had been followed. She had meant to return it, but had been swept away by everything that happened afterward. There was also one unread text message. The words were short, typed hastily, without punctuation. If you have time, I have something to tell you about your mother. Emma read it aloud, her eyes widening. Luca leaned forward. Timestamp? 8:18 p.m., she said quietly, right before she disappeared. Luca's jaw tightened. Then she found something. Either she read a file she wasn't supposed to, or someone got to her first. A chill rippled through Emma. So this isn't a warning, she murmured. It's to silence her. Luca rose and immediately dialed a number. Ryan, he said when the line connected. I'm sending you an image. Cross-check it with any known industrial or municipal structures that match the background. Look for a concrete wall with an X-shaped crack and a ceiling fan with exposed wiring. It's our only lead. As Luca relayed the technical details, Emma walked to the secure room. She took the printed photo of Camille and pinned it to the whiteboard beside the map of her father's investigation. The note her father had once written in blue ink stared back at her. Not too late. Emma touched the photo of her friend, whispering the same words. This time, not as a promise to her father, but to Camille. Not too late. And this time, she meant it. Because next time, she would be the one to find her before it was. 4 hours after Ryan fed Camille's photo into the geo-imaging search network, the first match came through a near-perfect alignment of the cracked concrete wall and ceiling fan seen in the picture. It led to an abandoned construction complex 20 miles south of Portland, once a concrete plant, deserted for nearly a decade. Luca stared at the satellite images, rows of decaying warehouses glimmering under the moon, corrugated roofs pitted with holes, the main gate blocked by rusted barbed wire. Yet in the dirt outside, tire tracks shone fresh. Emma's fists clenched. She couldn't let Camille stay there another second. Whether Camille was alive or not, they would not leave her behind. Luca called in 2 men from his old unit, former agents he trusted only for emergencies. Not police, not FBI, no red tape, no hesitation, only action. At 2 o'clock in the morning, they left the mountain cabin in 2 unmarked SUVs. Emma rode in the back seat, wearing a bullet-resistant vest Luca had handed her. In her lap lay a hand-drawn map showing the plant's layout, entry points, sightlines, and camera positions marked in red ink. They would split into 2 teams. Luca's unit would infiltrate through a drainage tunnel on the south side, while the other team created a diversion at the main gate. Emma had been told to stay in the car, but Luca's voice had cut through her protest. If they spot you waiting, Camille will be the one who pays. We don't have time for backup. You're coming with me. They arrived at 3:17 a.m. The sky was pitch black, the air cold enough to sting. Only the thin moon broke through the clouds, glinting off rusted window frames. From a distance, they killed the headlights and switched to night vision gear. No one spoke. Every movement was deliberate, soundless. Emma followed Luca's lead, her heartbeat pounding but her mind strangely clear. She was no longer the terrified woman running from shadows. She was walking into the den of those who had murdered her father, taken her friend, and tried to bury the truth. The drainage hatch opened with a muted groan. They crawled through 15 meters of narrow, damp tunnel, the earth pressing close around them. Dirt smeared her sleeves, the air thick with mold. Inside, the factory loomed vast and hollow, the smell of rust and oil clinging to the walls. A few overhead lights flickered weakly. Footsteps echoed in the distance, followed by a murmur in Italian. Luca raised a fist stop. Hand signals swept through the group. One man up the stairwell to scout, two remaining at Emma's side. She held the photo of Camille in her hand, tracing the outlines of the cracked wall, searching. Then she saw it, the faint X carved into the metal of a nearby door. Luca gave the count with his fingers. 1, 2, 3. The door flew open under his boot. Inside, Camille was huddled on the floor, wrists bound, mouth taped. Her eyes went wide as she saw Emma. Two men turned, one with a baton, the other reaching for his gun, but Luca was faster. He disarmed the first with a strike to the wrist and dropped the second with a single, echoing gunshot. The smell of cordite filled the room. A second later, a sharp kick sent the first man crashing against the wall, unconscious. Emma rushed forward, ripping the tape from Camille's mouth, freeing her hands. Tears spilled down her face as Camille gasped for breath. "They know," she managed to whisper, trembling. "They know." But the words broke off. A piercing alarm wailed from the upper floor. The building shuddered as metal doors slammed shut. Over the radio, one of Luca's men shouted, "4 hostiles incoming from the gate, armed!" There was no way back. Luca grabbed both women, pulling them down the hall toward the lower level. Gunfire cracked above, bullets slicing the air, ricocheting off steel. One of the team was hit in the shoulder but kept firing to cover them. "Exits behind the storage bays," Luca barked. "The cars waiting by the tree line move." They sprinted through a maze of broken machinery, jagged scrap tearing at their clothes. Dust and rust clung to the air, thick as smoke. The final door slammed open under Luca's shoulder, spilling them into the gray edge of dawn. The sky was paling, a thin line of light creeping over the horizon. Camille's face, smeared with blood and grime, turned toward the sunrise alive. Emma held her close, half carrying her to the waiting SUV. The engines roared, tires screeching across the gravel as bullets whined past. Only when the last echo of gunfire faded behind them did Luca exhale. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the women in the back seat, Emma clutching Camille's hand, both trembling, both alive. A night soaked in blood and ash, but Camille was safe. And in that moment, Emma understood why her father had chosen to die alone. Because sometimes, truth isn't something written down, it's something you save. They returned to the mountain safe house at dawn, just as the first pale light broke over the ridge of old pines. The world outside was hushed, wrapped in a gray stillness that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the night. Camille was immediately taken to the small medical room Luca had set up, where he and Ryan worked quickly cleaning her wounds, starting an IV, checking for signs of shock. She barely spoke. Her fingers clung to Emma's hand with desperate strength, as if letting go might make everything that had just happened dissolve back into nightmare. Emma stayed beside her the entire time, watching those trembling fingers, unable to ignore the truth pressing on her heart. Camille had seen something worth killing for, and if that was true, then she wasn't just another victim. She was holding a key that someone had tried to bury for good. By late afternoon, Camille's voice was stronger. The color had begun to return to her face, though her eyes still held that faraway look of someone who had seen the edge of death. Emma sat beside her bed, speaking softly. "Tell me everything," she said. Camille hesitated, then began haltingly. 2 days earlier, while reorganizing Emma's old research files for a new article, she had found a small USB drive taped to the underside of a drawer with double-sided tape. No label, no markings, just a plain black device, easily missed. Curious, she had plugged it into her laptop at the office. Inside was a single encrypted file, locked with a password. She hadn't been able to open it. But almost immediately afterward, her phone rang an unlisted number and she knew, somehow, she was being watched. She'd tried calling Emma that same night. And then everything went dark. Emma called for Luca and Ryan. Ryan brought in his forensic laptop and began working on the USB, still tucked safely in Camille's jacket when they had rescued her. It looked harmless, but it took nearly 40 minutes to break the encryption. When the final file opened, the air in the room seemed to still. It was a full system backup Jack Sullivan's hard drive, preserved and hidden for 13 years. Inside were pages of financial records, secret meeting transcripts, coded transfers, and, most damning of all, video footage of senior government and humanitarian officials directly overseeing or shielding the human trafficking network he had been investigating. One video, nearly 6 minutes long, showed Jack meeting a gray-suited man at an outdoor cafe. The camera angle was perfect, the man's face unmistakable. The accompanying audio captured his voice smooth Eastern accent, dripping with power. "You can dig all you want, Agent Sullivan," he said, "but touch Jude, and you're signing your own death warrant. We don't let small men ruin a national operation." Jack didn't respond. The recording ran to the end, and then his own quiet voice, barely audible, almost to himself said, "The truth has to survive, even if I don't." The words hit Emma like a blow. Every line of code, every file, every sound was a cut through the years of confusion and silence. Her father hadn't simply died chasing a lead too far. He had reached the core of something rotten, and he had built a failsafe, a final insurance policy not for his own life, but for the truth itself. Lucas straightened, his expression grave. "With this drive," he said, "we could take down at least 3 high-ranking officials. But if we release it now, we're not just fighting the Mafia anymore. We'll be fighting the same system he once served." Emma didn't look away from the screen. "He knew this moment would come," she said quietly. "He prepared for it." The reflection of the monitor glowed across her face, calm, resolute, unflinching. She realized this was the crossroads her father had foreseen, the one he hadn't lived to reach. Now the choice was hers. Expose everything and risk chaos, or wait for the one moment when truth could not be silenced or twisted. Either way, she knew there was no going back. She was no longer just Jack Sullivan's daughter. She was the one meant to finish what he started. And the truth at last had not been buried. Emma sat alone before the computer screen, the cold blue glow washing over her tired face, tracing the lines of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could erase. Her father's hard drive lay on the desk beside her, small, unassuming, yet pulsing with the quiet intensity of something alive, like a surrogate heartbeat keeping the truth from flatlining into oblivion. Every file within it was an indictment, every line of code a blade aimed at the heart of the powerful men who had built an empire of silence atop human suffering. But she knew the price of revelation. If she released everything, dozens of arrests could follow, hundreds of victims might finally be freed. Her father's name, Jack Sullivan, would be cleared after 13 years of being reduced to a police footnote, death by accident. Yet Emma also understood what would come next. They wouldn't sue. They wouldn't smear her in the press. They would retaliate with blood. Camille could be taken again. Luca's team would no longer be safe, and she, the keeper of the key, would be hunted to the ends of the earth. Luca entered quietly, stopping behind her. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost reverent. "You don't have to do this," he said. "No one would blame you if you walked away. Your father already gave everything." Emma shook her head, eyes still fixed on the encrypted string scrolling across the monitor. "If I walk away, All he protected dies with him. This time, the choice is mine. The question is how to do it without losing more lives. Luca came closer, sat beside her, and opened his laptop. On the screen was a network diagram, an intricate web of nodes and channels. Ryan and I drew this up, he said. A layered leak system. The files will pass through multiple encrypted relays across several countries before reaching vetted journalists and human rights networks. Nothing goes live all at once. Each fragment will be accompanied by verified testimony and forensic proof. If the main feed is compromised, a backup will auto-trigger from Switzerland. The people there know what's coming. They've arranged legal teams and witness protection. Emma scanned every line of the plan, her brow furrowed. Then she looked up. "And Camille?" she asked quietly. "She just survived hell. I can't make her a target again." Luca nodded as though expecting it. "I've already arranged a place for her Idaho. A friend of mine is sheriff there. No one knows what she's seen. Her medical report lists her as unconscious during the incident, unable to testify. She'll disappear for as long as it takes." Emma leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. Memories pressed in the night her father never came home, his worn leather jacket, his quiet smile behind the camera lens. Would he have risked lives for justice? She wondered. But then she heard his voice from the recording once more. "The truth must survive, even if I don't." It was never about revenge, never about legacy. It was about ending what should have ended long ago. She opened her eyes and met Luca's gaze. "Do it," she said. "Release everything, but do it so fast they can't breathe, can't cover, can't kill another soul before the light hits them." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Luca nodded slowly. There was something unreadable in his eyes, admiration, sorrow, pride. He knew that from this moment on, there would be no going back for any of them. But he also knew this was why Jack Sullivan had spared him all those years ago, not so he could live, but so he could stand here, now, beside the woman who carried her father's defiance in her veins. As Ryan began the transmission, lines of encrypted code flickered across the screen, data packets launching one by one into the digital ether, unstoppable, irretrievable. Emma watched in silence. The rhythmic pulse of the progress bars looked almost like a song, mechanical and beautiful in its precision. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether justice would rise or more blood would fall, but for the first time in 13 years, she wasn't afraid. Because tonight, she had chosen the side of light, no matter how dark the road ahead. Less than 12 hours after the files went live, following precisely the staggered route Luca and Ryan had designed, the world began to tremble. Major news outlets across Europe and North America released the first wave of evidence: audio recordings, fragments of video, and the faces of powerful men whose voices had once shaped entire nations. On underground forums, the tension was electric. Whispers spread that a major crime syndicate had placed a bounty on the heads of the traitors. Emma monitored everything from the safe house control room. Her pulse raced, but she kept her focus steady. There was no stopping the reaction now. The data was too widely distributed. All they had to do was survive the first few days after that. The dominoes would fall on their own. Luca checked the perimeter feeds every few minutes, coordinating with Ryan and their outer sentry, Blake, a former Special Forces operative, calm and precise. But something about the man's demeanor had been wrong all evening. Restless, too quiet. Twice, Blake had offered to switch shifts earlier than scheduled. By the third time, Luca's suspicion was a knot in his chest. In the world he came from, instinct was a language written in scars, and tonight it screamed. Around 2 a.m., while Emma drifted asleep in the reading room, a faint metallic creak sliced through the silence. Just the sound of a hinge soft, almost nothing but Luca was on his feet before the echo died. Gun drawn, he motioned for Ryan to check the monitors while he moved down the darkened hall. steps silent on the wooden floor. Only the blue glow of Ryan's laptop painted the walls in flickering light. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Then stillness. Luca pressed his back against the wall beside the rear door. It eased open a fraction, and a silhouette slipped inside. Not an intruder. Blake. Luca stepped from the shadows, weapon raised, voice low and sharp as wire. Why? Blake froze, hands half raised, eyes wide but eerily calm. I didn't have a choice, he whispered. They got to me first. If I didn't do it, they'd kill my family. Luca's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. At that exact instant, Emma, awakened by the voices, opened her door. The movement drew Blake's eye. His hand darted to his holster. It all happened inside a single breath. Ryan shouted from the far end of the hall. Emma cried out Luca's name. A gunshot split the silence. No one could say whose bullet it was. But it hit Luca in the shoulder, spinning him back, crimson blooming across his shirt. Ryan was on Blake in an instant, slamming him to the floor, pinning his wrists until the pistol clattered away. Emma dropped beside Luca, pressing her trembling hands over the wound, trying to stop the flow. Blake, bound and pale, muttered apologies through gritted teeth. They sent a photo, he gasped. My wife. My son. One call. I couldn't. The rest dissolved into incoherent pleas. Luca's body shuddered, pain searing through him, yet his gaze never left Blake. There was no anger there, only understanding, and the weary recognition of a truth he already knew. In wars like these, the line between loyalty and betrayal was thinner than air. Ryan worked quickly. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed bone and artery, a flesh wound, survivable. Still, Emma couldn't stop shaking. If Luca had moved an inch slower, the bullet would have hit her. Or Camille. She stayed beside him through the long, bleeding hours until dawn. His hand was warm but heavy in hers, and when she looked out the window at the pale morning light spilling across the trees, the realization came cold and clear. Danger didn't always wear the face of the enemy. Sometimes it lived in the same room, breathed the same air, shared the same fight. And in a war against the dark, the deadliest bullet was never the one aimed at your body, but the one that pierced your trust. Emma awoke to a room washed in sterile white. Soft light filtered through a half-drawn curtain, painting thin silver lines across the sheets. The world was quiet, so quiet she could hear the faint beep of a heart monitor and the distant shuffle of footsteps somewhere down the hospital corridor. For a moment she didn't understand where she was. Then the soreness hit her shoulder, wrapped tight in bandages, an IV line tugging at her arm, her lips dry as paper. The dull ache radiating from her chest and wrist snapped the fragments of memory back into place. The gunshot. Blake's face. The smell of blood and smoke. Luca's body collapsing onto the wooden floor as she screamed his name. Emma tried to sit up, but a nurse hurried in, gentle hands on her shoulders, voice soft but firm. She was safe, the woman said. The injuries were mostly from exhaustion and impact. They'd brought her here under an alias, through a secured route, immediately after the attack on the safe house. Her first question was about Luca. The nurse only shook her head. She'd been given strict instructions, no patient names, no details. The answer, polite but cold, hollowed her chest more than the pain ever could. Ryan was still somewhere out there coordinating the fallout, but if Luca hadn't appeared, hadn't called, it meant the situation was far from stable. The next 3 days bled together in a haze of half-sleep and restless waking. Each night she dreamed the same dream. Luca sitting beside her bed, silent, eyes shadowed with something unreadable, his wounded arm seeping through its bandage. And every time she startled awake, the chair was empty, the air still. No message, no sign. Camille came once, pale, drawn, voice trembling under the weight of too many things left unsaid. She told Emma that Ryan had relocated her to a new safe zone, that the data leaks were still unfolding across the world, that they were winning. But Luca, no one knew where he was, or whether he'd made it out alive. When Emma finally managed to reach out to Ryan, a single text came from an unlisted number. Everything is on schedule. You need to rest. Don't look for Luca right now. She read those 10 words again and again, dissecting them like a code, hoping for a hidden promise. But there was nothing, only the heavy silence that followed. So she began to write. Her father's notes, Camille's abduction, Blake's betrayal, every thread of the story stitched together across blank pages. Each word steadied her hands, gave her breath. Yet in the middle of every paragraph there was a pause, a blank space where one name belonged. Luca. She wrote it, then crossed it out. Wrote it again, erased it harder. She didn't know if she was angry at him or afraid for him, or simply trying not to hope, but his absence had become its own kind of wound, quiet, deep, impossible to dress. On the fourth day, Emma left the hospital under discreet escort. Ryan never appeared. Camille was gone to her hidden refuge. The next sequence of her father's data was set to drop within hours. The headlines were ready. The world was already watching. Yet as the car pulled away and the city blurred into gray light, none of that mattered. Not the justice, not the exposure, not the apologies that would come too late. What she wanted, what she needed, was to see him. The man who had walked beside her into the heart of the darkness, who had believed when no one else would, and who had vanished without a sound. All that remained were the questions he left behind and the quiet space where his name still lived, beating softly beneath her bandaged heart. On the fifth morning, as Emma returned from a session with the federal investigative team dispatched to Portland to handle the fallout from the data leak, news came in that felt like a physical blow. An FBI agent in a gray suit stepped out of the black car parked before her safe apartment and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside were an arrest warrant and a copy of the detention file, and the name on it read, Luca Romano, taken into custody at 2 o'clock in the morning on charges of participating in an international money laundering ring tied to the Italian Mafia, along with counts relating to illegal weapons possession and obstruction of a federal investigation. And Emma read his name over and over until the world seemed to quiet around her, because she could not reconcile the man who had saved her and protected her, and who alone knew the full truth with the criminal label now printed in black and white, as if all his efforts to expose her father's case had been folded into evidence against him. The first formal questioning took place in the federal building downtown, in a glass-walled room so cold it felt like a stage set, a metal table between them and two agents taking turns to ask questions that squeezed at her breath. How involved had Luca really been with the Mafia network? Where had the funds come from that he used to finance the rescue of Camille? Had he taken part in illicit activities in the past? Emma sat opposite them as the primary witness and told the story from the beginning. From the night she received the message about her father to the moment Luca pulled her away from Fairmount Cemetery, and through every piece of data on the hidden hard drive, stressing that Luca had left that world years before, that every action of his had been aimed at exposing the criminal network that killed her father, and that without him, the case would never have been opened. Yet each time she thought her testimony might save him, another packet of documents would be placed on the table revealing that the import company Luca once ran had been used to launder suspicious transactions over a decade, some funds moving through anonymous accounts the Bureau could not yet trace, and the pages bore his signature secrets he had guarded, now returned like a blade to wound him. And when an agent asked, "Do you think Luca Romano used you to fulfill his own aims?" Emma paused as if listening to something only she could hear, and then said softly, "If he had wanted to use me, he could have done it 13 years ago when my father was still alive. But he did not. He chose to save, rather than to destroy." "I believe that," And although her words filled the room for a few suspended seconds, she understood that belief could not substitute for evidence. For in the world of law, trust is a luxury few can afford. Days later, she was allowed to visit the detention facility to confirm details for his defense lawyer, and when Luca appeared across the thick glass in the beige prison uniform, he looked thinner, but his eyes held the same depth and steadiness. And speaking through the phone, he asked only one thing: "Are you safe?" Emma nodded, tears slipping from her face before she could wipe them away, and said in a low voice, "They are using you as a shield to stop what we've started, but I will not let them bury the truth again." And Luca watched her with an expression that was at once sad and proud, saying, "Do not risk yourself any more, Emma. Your father died for this. I will not let it happen to you." Yet she understood that if she stopped now, all their sacrifices would be for nothing, and when the visit ended, they placed their hands against the glass on either side of the cold barrier and felt only one another's warm breath. And in that brief, fragile contact, Emma realized she had become more than a witness to Jack Sullivan's case. She had become the keeper of the flame the two men, a father and a once damned man saved by debt, had together lit in the dark. A week after her visit to Luca at the detention center, Emma received a call she never expected. It was Agent Melinda from the Federal Department of Justice, her voice firm yet trembling beneath the weight of emotion. "We've been coordinating with Interpol and UNDOC," she said. 47 people, including 18 minors, were rescued from 3 separate sites, New Jersey, Texas, and the Arizona border, thanks to the data extracted from the drive you provided. Emma stepped onto the balcony of her secured apartment, the city glowing gold beneath the late afternoon sun. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Her chest tightened, her throat ached, and a strange weight lifted from her shoulders all at once. It wasn't pride, it wasn't victory. It was the pure, fragile relief of someone who had run through darkness for years and had finally glimpsed light at the end of the tunnel. Then Melinda's tone slowed, each word deliberate. "We've reopened the full case file on Agent Jack Sullivan's accident. With the evidence gathered, especially the recording of his meeting with a high-ranking official now positively identified, we conclude that Jack Sullivan was assassinated for refusing to cooperate and for secretly collecting evidence against an international human trafficking network." The sentence sliced through Emma's heart like a blade through ice. Her knees weakened. She clutched the railing, tears spilling freely. Her father, the man the world had believed died in a car crash from fatigue, the man dismissed as paranoid and mocked by his peers, was finally vindicated. Not by rumor or sympathy, but by a federal declaration of truth. Days later, a quiet ceremony was held at FBI headquarters to honor agents who had died fighting organized crime. Jack Sullivan's name was read first. Emma wore a black suit and pinned her father's old badge to her lapel as she walked to the stage to accept his posthumous commendation. The room fell silent as a screen lit up with his photograph and the words, "He never accepted silence as safety." As Emma left the hall, a middle-aged man approached her. He was the father of one of the 47 survivors. He didn't cry. He only took her hand and said softly, "Without you and your father, my daughter wouldn't be alive." His words sank deep, filling the emptiness that grief had hollowed out. That afternoon, Emma returned to Fairmount Cemetery. She stood before her father's grave, the place where it had all begun, holding a copy of the official Justice Department letter, declaring him not a disgraced agent, but the key figure who had exposed one of the largest criminal networks of the past 2 decades. She laid the letter beside her mother's wedding ring on the cool stone. There were no words left to say, only silence, and now that silence no longer felt heavy, but peaceful. The late autumn wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wet grass and the whisper of dry leaves. Emma lifted her eyes to the gray-silver sky, to the question that had haunted her for years. Was he ever wrong? Now she knew the answer. not because 47 lives had been saved, not because his honor was restored, but because, in the end, what he left behind was not a forgotten death, but a brave life that reignited faith in a world long overshadowed by darkness. 18 months after her father's name was cleared, Emma's life had shifted in ways she could never have imagined. She no longer lived in Portland, no longer wrote under the byline Emma Sullivan, and no longer chased stories for a newsroom that had long since moved on. Now, she worked as an independent consultant for international anti-human trafficking organizations, analyzing encrypted case files, restoring corrupted data, and tracing the cold trails of the missing. Her home sat tucked away in a quiet mountain village in Vermont, where winters blanketed the earth in white and summers smelled of pine and warm soil. There, no one knew who she had once been, the woman who had gone toe-to-toe with the Mafia, rattled the justice system, and lost nearly everything because of one old box filled with her father's secrets. Camille had built something new, too. She now ran a nonprofit called The Exit, dedicated to helping trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. She wrote to Emma once a month, always by hand, in looping cursive sometimes to share stories of girls learning to bake, other times enclosing a photograph of a handmade necklace given as a thank you by one of them. Emma kept those letters in the top drawer of her desk, not as keepsakes of the past, but as reminders that nothing they endured had been meaningless. The only part of that past Emma could not leave behind was Luca. Since his arrest, his trial had dragged on for 8 months. Thanks to her testimony, the cooperation of international agencies, and the decrypted archives from her father's drive, his sentence had been drastically reduced. He was not acquitted, but granted leniency under the Witness Cooperation Program, 2 years of supervised confinement at a secure facility. Emma never visited him during that time, not out of anger, but because she knew they both needed space to heal, to rebuild, to see if the versions of themselves that had survived could still find one another again. Then, one September afternoon, as the Vermont forest turned gold beneath the fading sun, the doorbell rang. Emma froze for a moment, heart skipping a beat as if some part of her had already known. When she opened the door, there he was, Luca, standing in the soft amber light, wearing the same dark brown coat she remembered from their last meeting through the thick glass of the detention center. He looked thinner, the years etched gently into his face, but his eyes were unchanged, steady, quiet, impossibly familiar. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Luca smiled, a small, unguarded smile that seemed to bridge all the months between them. He carried no luggage, only a folded paper in his pocket, the official notice of his completed cooperation program, declaring him a free man. Emma invited him in. She brewed 2 cups of peppermint tea, and they sat together on the balcony as the evening deepened over the rustling trees. There was no need to revisit the past. They both knew words would only dull what silence already understood. Luca told her about the books he had read during confinement, about his idea of opening a small farm to teach skills to those trying to start over. Emma spoke of the cases she was still helping to unravel, of codes that refused to yield, of nights when hope thinned to a thread kept alive only by the memory of her father and the man sitting beside her now. When dusk settled and the air grew cool, Luca turned to her and asked softly, "Are you okay?" Emma held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "I don't know if okay is the right word," she said, "but I'm alive. And for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of what comes next." In that moment, she understood. They could never return to who they once were, but they could begin again from the fragments tempered by blood, loss, and unbroken faith. This time, there were no secrets left between them, only truth, and the quiet promise of a future unfolding before them under the tender golden silence of a Vermont autumn. 6 months after the day Luca appeared at Emma's doorstep, winter once again blanketed the little Vermont village in white. Their lives were no longer haunted by midnight phone calls or the ghostly silhouettes that once lingered in rearview mirrors. Together, they built the small details of an ordinary, precious life: a garden behind the house, a shared workspace lined with books and maps, quiet Saturday mornings brewing coffee, and Sunday walks under the soft amber glow of the town's few streetlights. Yet there was one thing Luca had never mentioned since the day he returned, and one thing Emma had never asked, as though both were silently guarding a sacred stillness that neither was ready to disturb. Until one early March morning when the ground began to thaw and the first birds broke the long silence of winter, Luca said he wanted to go back to Fairmount. The name alone made Emma pause. Fairmount wasn't just where her father rested, it was where everything had begun, the place that had haunted her for over a decade with questions that refused to fade. She looked at Luca searchingly, but he only smiled and took her hand, as if to say that this time they were not returning for ghosts, but for something new. They arrived at the cemetery late in the afternoon, sunlight lingering softly over the old stones, young grass beginning to push through the earth, and a cool spring breeze whispering that time never truly stops, not even for grief. Emma walked slowly down the cobbled path, her hand clasped in Luca's, her heart strangely unsteady. They stopped before Jack Sullivan's grave, still as modest as the day she had placed the letter of vindication upon it. She knelt to set down a bouquet of white lilies, then stood quietly for a while, as if speaking to her father in the language only silence could hold. When she turned around, Luca was no longer beside her. He was kneeling just behind, holding a small velvet box the color of twilight, his eyes trembling yet bright, the same look she remembered from the first night she saw him, under the dim lights of that same cemetery years ago. There were no rehearsed words, no roses, no grand gestures, just a single sentence. "Jack Sullivan gave me a second chance to live," he said, voice unsteady. "And you turned it into a life worth living. I don't want to keep walking alone. Will you marry me, Emma?" Emma froze, tears spilling before she could breathe them back. Not out of surprise, not out of uncertainty, but because her heart had never felt so certain. She nodded, no words, no ceremony needed, and Luca slid a simple silver ring onto her finger, the same ring he had kept throughout his confinement, a silent promise to the man who had forever changed both their destinies. They stayed beside her father's grave for a long time, talking as if he were listening about the cabin they planned to restore, about Camille and the young girls learning new trades, about the wildflower fields Emma still dreamed of. Luca was not a perfect man. He carried darkness, scars, and mistakes that could never be erased. But it was precisely that imperfection that made him an essential part of Emma's healing. When they finally rose to leave Fairmount, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. Emma turned for one last look, whispering softly, just for herself, "Dad, I didn't choose the easy life, but I chose the right man." Then she took Luca's hand, and together they walked down the stone path, the spring wind brushing against their cheeks, while somewhere in that quiet, golden light, the future began, born from a promise as simple as love and as enduring as memory. 3 months after the proposal, Emma and Luca held a small ceremony in the garden behind their Vermont home. There was no grand stage, no endless guest list, only the quiet presence of those who truly understood what they had endured. Camille stood as maid of honor, radiant in a forest green dress, the same color as the woods that had once sheltered their escape. Ryan was there too, seated quietly near the back on a wooden bench, nodding now and then when the minister spoke of faith. The ring Luca slipped onto Emma's hand wasn't an expensive piece of jewelry, but a simple silver band he had found in an antique shop in town. Inside it were two engraved Italian words, "Verita viva," the truth lives. When they exchanged their vows, no one mentioned what had been lost. No one spoke of the past. Yet in their eyes, Everyone could see what had been forgiven, the scars that had finally healed, and a future being written in understanding and grace. After the wedding, Emma stepped away from the International Investigation Program to focus on writing a book titled The Truth. Lives a story not just about her father, but about people like Camille, like Luca, and like herself. The book revealed no real names, but every page bore the weight of blood, tears, and the unwavering belief that silence is never safety. When it was published, it quickly became one of the year's most celebrated nonfiction works. Emma, however, did not attend the award ceremony, nor did she grant any interviews. She chose instead to stay in Vermont, where she and Luca began building a psychological recovery center for survivors of human trafficking. They called it Horizon House, the place where the horizon begins. Camille ran the operations, Ryan oversaw security and communications, and Emma devoted herself to counseling survivors who were learning how to reclaim their voices and tell their stories. One afternoon, while Emma was teaching a 16-year-old girl how to write her first journal entry again, Luca walked in holding an envelope. It was a letter from the United Nations, an official invitation for Emma to speak at a special conference on anti-trafficking initiatives. She read it quietly, then set it on the desk. Luca watched her, saying nothing, only offering a small, knowing smile. "If you want to go this time," he said softly, "I'll go with you." Emma didn't answer right away. She simply reached for his hand. Maybe they would go. Maybe they wouldn't. Their fight was no longer on the world stage. It was here, in the quiet hours of each afternoon, in the sound of wind whispering through pine trees, in the eyes of those who had survived hell and still dared to dream of tomorrow. One early morning, Emma returned once more to Fairmount Cemetery, carrying a single copy of her published book and a sprig of dried lavender. She placed both on her father's grave without a word. The air was still, the sky clear, the warmth of early summer rising gently over the hills. Before leaving, she turned back and whispered, "I've lived the way you did without regret, without fear." And for the first time, she felt it the past had finally gone to rest. No more shadows trailing behind her. No more unfinished dreams. Only the long road ahead, where light led the way and where, at last, she no longer walked alone. The debt has been paid. The truth still lives. It is not merely a phrase, but the culmination of a 13-year journey, a daughter's search to restore her father's honor, a man's emergence from the shadows into light, and the reunion of broken fragments into a whole and meaningful life. Emma never forgot that first night she received the strange message that pulled her back to Fairmount Cemetery. Nor could she forget the moment Luca knelt down amid the evening wind beside her father's resting place and proposed with a heart that had once been shattered. They endured losses too deep to name, choices that seemed to have no way out. Yet in the end, they found each other not in a fairy tale ending, but in a life that was real, where love walked hand in hand with responsibility, and where pain became the seed of compassion. This story is not only about crime or the unveiling of secrets long hidden in the dark. It is, above all, a reminder that there are truths which can never be buried forever, and debts that can only be repaid through courage and love. Whoever you are, whatever you have been through, believe this: the past does not define you. What defines you is how you face it, how you rise again after falling. Live with sincerity, because only the truth endures. If this story has touched a quiet corner of your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Emma and Luca's journey? Have you ever stood at the crossroads between silence and truth? Have you ever felt lost, only to find your way back through something small but meaningful that restored your faith in life? We deeply hope to hear your reflections, your stories, no matter how small, because you are the ones who help continue stories like this. And if you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so that more people can be inspired by our videos. The YouTube channel Underworld Love Stories will continue bringing you emotional, profound, and heartfelt stories drawn from real life, told with empathy and deep respect for human values. Thank you for spending your time with us on this journey, wishing you and your loved ones good health, optimism, and days filled with peace, purpose, and grace. Until next time, from all of us at Underworld Love Stories,